The volcanic sand beneath his boots was still cool from the Pacific night, black and coarse like crushed glass, grinding between soul and stone. Corporal Tony Stein pressed his body flat against the terrace slope, the weight of his custom-made weapon digging into his shoulder. A Browning A&M2, 50 caliber aircraft, machine gun, stripped from a wrecked Navy fighter, reconfigured by his own hands in the machine shops aboard the troop transport. Around him, the first light of morning revealed what the pre-invasion briefings had called Red Beach 1. But what would be remembered as something far more terrible. The air tasted of sulfur and salt. Somewhere ahead, buried in the volcanic rock of Mount Suribachi's northern slopes, 16 Japanese fortified positions waited in absolute silence. The weapon he carried had no official name in any Marine Corps manual. His fellow Marines called it the Stinger. 30 pounds of repurposed aviation armament. Fed B, a custom 100-round detachable box magazine, capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Rate of fire that would have required 2 men to operate any standard infantry weapon of equivalent power. But Tony Stein carried it alone. The doctrine said it couldn't be done. The manuals said a single Marine couldn't sustain the weight, control the recoil, manage the ammunition, and maintain accuracy with a weapon system designed for wing-mounted aircraft operations. The doctrine had never met Tony Stein. This moment, this convergence of one man, one improvised weapon, and 16 fortified Japanese positions on the blackest sand in the Pacific represented something larger than a single Marine's courage. It crystallized the fundamental miscalculation that had led the Japanese Empire into a war it could not win. For 4 years, imperial strategists had studied American industrial capacity, analyzed American fighting doctrine, and concluded that democracy produced soft soldiers. They had calculated that a nation of individuals, raised on abundance and personal freedom, could never match the collective sacrifice and warrior discipline of men trained from birth to view death as the ultimate service to the emperor. They had observed American Marines in training and concluded that soldiers who questioned orders, who valued individual life, who came from a culture of comfort and choice, would break when faced with men who embraced death as spiritual transcendence. The volcanic fortress. Before Tony Stein proved how catastrophically wrong they had been. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima had spent 8 months preparing for the American invasion. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kudiviyashi, commander of the island's 21,000-man garrison, had revolutionized Japanese defensive doctrine after studying American amphibious operations across the Pacific. He had ordered his men to abandon the traditional strategy of meeting invaders at the water's edge with suicidal banzai charges. Instead, they had burrowed into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock like industrious termites, creating a subterranean fortress system of astonishing complexity. 11 miles of tunnels connected 1,500 defensive positions. Reinforced concrete bunkers, invisible from the air or sea, commanded interlocking fields of fire across every approach. Artillery pieces mounted in caves that could be wheeled forward to fire, then withdrawn before counter-battery fire could find them. The island had been transformed into a single massive fortification, every cubic meter of volcanic stone weaponized into killing geometry. And at Red Beach 1, 16 of these positions formed a defensive network specifically designed to annihilate any force attempting to advance inland from the landing zones. Each bunker was a masterwork of military engineering, reinforced concrete walls, 6 feet thick, firing ports positioned to create crossfire zones where advancing Marines would be caught in overlapping fields of automatic weapons fire, connected by communication tunnels, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened positions without exposing themselves to American firepower. The Japanese soldiers manning these positions had been told that every day they held Iwo Jima postponed the American invasion of the Japanese Ome Islands. They had been told that their deaths here would save countless Japanese civilians from American barbarism. They had accepted their annihilation as predetermined fact and prepared their positions accordingly. They had not prepared for Tony Stein. The pre-bombardment had been the longest and most intensive of the Pacific War. 3 days of sustained naval gunfire that consumed more ordnance than had been expended in some entire island campaigns. The battleships had hurled 14-inch shells into the volcanic slopes until their gun barrels glowed red in the darkness. Marine commanders had watched the island disappear beneath curtains of explosive force and allowed themselves to believe that nothing could survive such devastation. They had been wrong. As the first waves of landing craft ground onto the black sand beaches, the volcanic slopes erupted with fire. The Japanese bunkers, untouched beneath their layers of reinforced concrete and stone, revealed themselves only by the muzzle flashes of their weapons. Marines fell by the dozen in the first minutes, cut down by an enemy they could not see, could not locate, could not effectively return fire against. This was the crucible Tony Stein walked into at 06 for 7 hours, carrying a weapon that shouldn't exist to accomplish a mission that doctrine said required platoon strength. Assault teams supported by tanks and demolition engineers. What the Japanese defenders expected was what they had been trained to see Americans, who would advance cautiously, who would call for support, who would value their individual lives above mission accomplishment, who would hesitate when faced with certain death. What they encountered instead was a fundamental misunderstanding of what American individualism actually meant in combat. The Japanese warrior tradition taught that strength came from suppression of self, from collective identity, from acceptance of death as the highest duty. But Tony Stein represented something they had no cultural framework to comprehend. The American fighting man who carried his individualism into battle not as weakness, but as weapon, who improvised and adapted because democracy had taught him that rules were starting points rather than sacred boundaries, who risked death precisely because he valued life enough to fight for it. The Stinger opened fire at 06 for 9 hours. The sound was unlike anything in the Marine Corps' arsenal. Not the measured burst of a Browning M1919, not the rattling thunder of a 50 calibre M2, but the sustained roar of an aircraft weapon unleashed at ground level. The heavy .50 caliber rounds, designed to penetrate aircraft aluminum at altitude, tore through the concrete and stone of the Japanese bunkers like industrial drills. The first position fell silent within 30 seconds. Its firing port transformed into a gaping wound of shattered concrete. Tony Stein was already moving toward the second position before the defenders of the first understood they were under attack. Marine Corps' doctrine for bunker assaults was methodical and manpower intensive. A rifle team would establish a base of fire to suppress the bunker's weapons, while a demolition team maneuvered under covering fire to place satchel charges or direct flamethrower bursts through the firing ports. It required coordination, fire discipline, and usually resulted in casualties even when executed perfectly. Tony Stein had no demolition team, no covering fire, no supporting elements. He had the stinger and an understanding of violence that transcended doctrine. He moved toward the bunkers not in cautious advance, but in aggressive assault, firing sustained bursts that forced the Japanese defenders to abandon their firing ports or be cut down at their weapons. When the 100-round magazine ran dry, he dropped it and slammed in a fresh one with the practiced efficiency of a factory worker changing drill bits of motion. He had performed thousands of times in the machine shops and garages where he had learned his craft before the war. The Japanese soldiers in the bunkers had been told they were the spiritual elite of the Emperor's army, that their discipline and acceptance of death made them superior to the materialistic Americans. But spirituality offered no protection against physics. The .50 caliber rounds that Stein poured into their positions traveled at 2,910 feet per second, carrying 13,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. When they struck concrete, they created spalling fragments of stone and metal that turned the interior of the bunkers into killing chambers. When they struck human flesh, they produced wounds that no Bushido code could overcome. The defenders fought back with courage that bordered on the supernatural, remaining at their posts even as the walls around them disintegrated, firing their Type 92 heavy machine guns until the Stinger's return fire found them. But courage alone could not bridge the fundamental gap between what they had expected and what American industrial ingenuity had delivered. By 0658 hours, 4 bunkers had fallen silent. By 0703 hours, Marine riflemen, following in Tony Stein's wake, watched in something approaching religious awe as the lone Marine, wit, the Jurigid aircraft weapons systematically dismantled a defensive network that should have required company-level assault operations. The ammunition he expended in those first minutes would have sustained a standard machine gun crew for hours. But the Stinger was not a standard weapon, and Tony Stein was not executing a standard attack. He was demonstrating the fundamental principle that Japanese military planners had failed to account for, that American abundance was not a sign of weakness but a force multiplier of terrifying efficiency, that a nation which could strip machine guns from damaged aircraft and reconfigure them into infantry weapons in shipboard machine shops possessed an adaptive creativity that rigid military hierarchies could not match. The 9th bunker fought back with particular ferocity. Japanese soldiers emerged from a communication tunnel and attempted to flank Stein's position with a light machine gun team. He killed them with a sustained burst that expended 43 rounds in less than 3 seconds, then resumed his advance on the primary position without breaking stride. The 10th and 11th bunkers he suppressed simultaneously, pivoting between targets with the kind of tactical awareness that came not from training manuals, but from instinctive understanding of battlefield geometry. The volcanic sand around his position erupted with incoming fire from bunkers 12 and 13, and for a moment, the outcome seemed uncertain. Then the Stinger swung toward the source of the incoming rounds, and the unique sound of its aircraft, Tingeon-like roar echoed across. Red Beach won again. What sustained Tony Stein through these minutes was not the collective identity that Japanese doctrine assumed motivated all soldiers. It was something the imperial military apparatus had no framework to understand. The American fighting man's fierce individualism married to voluntary brotherhood. He fought alone, but he fought for the Marines around him, for the wounded men on the beach behind him, for the concept that individual human life possessed inherent value worth defending with individual human sacrifice. The Japanese soldier accepted death as inevitability. The American Marine risked death as choice, and that distinction made all the difference. By 0712 2 hours, 13 bunkers had been neutralized. The ammunition expenditure was staggering more than 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber, enough to arm a B-17's entire dorsal turret complement for a combat mission over Germany. But the Stinger kept firing, kept moving, kept advancing, because Tony Stein had prepared for this moment with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that pieced garage mechanics brought to their craft. He had modified the feed system, adjusted the gas regulator, reinforced the barrel shroud, created a weapon that could sustain a rate of fire that would have destroyed a standard machine gun within minutes. The Marines who'd watched him work in the ship's machine shops during the long voyage from Hawaii had thought him eccentric at best, possibly deranged. Now, they watched him advance across volcanic sand under fire that should have killed him a dozen times, and they understood they were witnessing something that would be studied in military academies for generations. The 14th bunker surrendered after its firing port had been completely destroyed by concentrated fire. Japanese soldiers emerged with their hands raised, their faces blackened with powder burns and concrete dust, their eyes carrying the stunned expression of men whose certainty had been shattered along with their fortifications. The 15th position fought until its last defender was killed at his weapon, maintaining fire discipline to the end, faithful to the Emperor and the warrior code that promised spiritual transcendence through death in battle. But spirituality could not defeat metal, and the armor-piercing, incendiary rounds that finally silenced the bunker demonstrated the uncomfortable truth that ideology surrendered to engineering when the margin of industrial capacity was wide enough. At 0717, hours 30 minutes after the assault began, the 16th bunker fell silent. Tony Stein stood amid the wreckage of the defensive network, the Stinger's barrel glowing cherry red from sustained fire. Volcanic sand fused to glass beneath his feet from the heat of expelled shell casings. Around him, the evidence of what one Marine with an improvised weapon had accomplished lay scattered across the terraced, slope-shattered concrete, destroyed weapon emplacements. Bodies of defenders who had fought with suicidal courage, but had never faced anything like the industrial violence that American abundance made possible. The human cost of what Tony Stein accomplished in those 30 minutes extended far beyond the 16 bunkers. By neutralizing this defensive network, he had opened an avenue of advance for his battalion, allowing Marines to push inland from Red Beach 1, instead of being pinned at the water's edge where Japanese artillery could massacre them. Medical officers estimated that his actions saved between 200 and 300 Marine lives that first day alone. But the deeper significance lay not in casualty statistics, but in what this assault represented about the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. The Japanese had studied American culture and concluded that individualism bred weakness. They had observed American abundance and assumed it produced softness. They had prepared their defenses accordingly, and they had been catastrophically wrong. In the bunkers, Tony Stein assaulted that morning. Japanese soldiers had been subsisting on rice rations that provided barely 1,500 calories per day. Their medical supplies had been depleted by months of American submarine interdiction. Their ammunition reserves were carefully rationed because Japan's industrial capacity could not replace expenditures at the rate American submarines were sinking supply ships. They had been told to hold every position to the death because Japan could not afford to lose Iwo Jima's strategic position. They fought with the courage of men who believed their sacrifice had meaning, who trusted that their deaths would buy time for the homeland, who accepted annihilation as predetermined fate. Tony Stein had eaten a hot breakfast that morning reconstituted eggs, coffee, and bread that would have seemed a feast to the Japanese defenders. The ammunition he expended so freely represented only a tiny fraction of the ordnance American industry could produce. When the Stinger's barrel finally gave out from thermal stress later that day, he could request a replacement weapon from supply officers who could access warehouses filled with equipment that Japanese defenders could barely imagine. He fought not because death was inevitable, but because life was worth defending. Not because the state demanded sacrifice, but because free men chose to risk everything to remain free. The recurring symbol of that day was not the Stinger itself, but the empty shell casings. It ejected brass cylinders that piled in, glittering heaps around Stein's position, each one representing not just a round fired, but a small miracle of industrial capacity. Those casings had been manufactured in factories across America, transported across 6,000 miles of ocean, delivered to the beach by a logistics network of staggering complexity, and expended with the casual abundance that came from fighting a war with virtually unlimited industrial backing. Japanese defenders counted every bullet. American Marines fired them until the barrels glowed. That difference, more than any tactical doctrine or strategic planning, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. Tony Stein would not survive Iwo Jima. On March 1, 1945, 9 days after his assault on the 16 bunkers, he was killed by Japanese sniper fire while advancing on yet another defensive position. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation noting his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But the dry language of military citations could not capture what his actions represented, not just individual heroism, but the vindication of a system that Japanese militarism had fundamentally misunderstood. The Japanese Empire had built its strategy on the assumption that democracies were weak, that nations which valued individual life could not match the collective sacrifice of totalitarian systems, that abundance produced softness rather than strength. Every bunker Tony Stein destroyed with his improvised weapon was a refutation of that assumption. Every shell casing that piled around his position was evidence that American industrial capacity, married to American creative individualism, created soldiers who could improvise solutions to problems that rigid military hierarchies could not even conceive. The warrior who embraced death fought bravely, but the Marine who valued life enough to risk it, who possessed the mechanical aptitude to rebuild an aircraft weapon into an infantry tool, who came from a culture that celebrated individual initiative rather than collective conformity, Marine proved unstoppable. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima would claim 6,821 American lives. Before the island was secured, nearly 20,000 Japanese defenders would die in the tunnels and bunkers they had spent months perfecting. The battle would be remembered as the bloodiest in Marine Corps history, the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. But within that larger narrative of horror and sacrifice, the 30 minutes that Tony Stein spent dismantling 16 bunkers with a weapon that shouldn't exist represented something essential about why the war ended as it did. Not because American Marines were more willing to die than Japanese soldiers. The casualty ratios proved otherwise. But because American democracy, for all its inefficiencies, and contradictions, produced fighting men who brought creativity and abundance to the battlefield, who improvised and adapted, who carried their individualism into combat as weapon rather than weakness. In the end, Bushido could not defeat spiritual discipline, could not overcome industrial capacity. The warrior, who accepted death as destiny, fought bravely and died faithfully. But the Marine, who valued life, who modified weapons in machine shops during long sea, who advanced on fortified positions with improvised firepower that doctrine said was impossible, that Marine represented the fundamental truth Japanese militarism had failed to grasp. Democracy did not produce weak soldiers. It produced Tony Stein. And against men like that, against the industrial abundance and creative individualism they embodied, the warriors of the Emperor never stood a chance. The shell casings remained on that volcanic slope long. After the battle ended, brass cylinders half buried in black sand, glinting in the Pacific sun, small monuments to the 30 minutes when one Marine with an improvised weapon proved that abundance was destiny. That creativity was force multiplier. That freedom, when fully mobilized, was simply unstoppable.